the movie is making a case for microfinance, and the case is all these different points, or they're building a case for a particular version of microfinance, and they're making this set of points. They start with the point that poor have poor access to credit, that they're reliable borrowers, that maybe group lending has something to do with the reliability, that microfinance can lift people out of poverty. The way it does it is through new businesses, and that and the fact that these new businesses generate increased earnings of women has the implication that there is then greater investment in human capital. So, and finally, there is an implied, but also I think important claim that there's no conflict between sort of the commercialization of microcredit and an emphasis on its social role. So those are the claims being made. So what I want to do today is mostly kind of go through the thinking behind what's the argument behind each of these, and then try to look at the data a bit. Okay, so what I want you to do is, in fact, is to start thinking of arguments why each of these things may or may not be true. So why would they be true? Why could they fail? So you can already start thinking about what we're going to do. The first one, we kind of know the answer to. That was what I think Esther covered in the first of these lectures. So I'm going to leave that. So the second one is, why is it that how are those two facts consistent? Why is credit access for the poor very bad, given that they're reliable borrowers? I mean, after all I care about is you repay. So if the poor are very reliable borrowers, why wouldn't they just get a loan? What would it be that? What would explain the combination of these two facts? That they're reliable borrowers, and yet, the interest rates they have to pay to borrow are very high. And so, I mean, the reason why that's a puzzle is, why would I want to, lend to General Motors when, some woman in Bangladesh is so much more reliable than General Motors, which is true. So, question is, then what's going on? Why does General Motors, which is not such a reliable repair, much better able to borrow than these poor women in Bangladesh? Yeah.
I would attribute it to two main things. One, General Motors has assets that can be seized in case they don't repay. And two, General Motors is looking for large amounts of money, so therefore it provides a lot of opportunity versus a poor woman in Bangladesh might be looking for $15. And if you're a U.S. investor and if you're looking to make an investment, it's easier if a company's looking for above a certain threshold of money.
Right,
$50 in fixed costs to get it.
Sure, but why is the U.S. company not? Why does it lend to money to General Motors rather than to Grameen Bank, who can then lend it to these people? I mean, that's a question of intermediation. I agree that Citibank should not be lending $15 to this woman, but Citibank doesn't have to lend it. It can go to some other organization which is already doing it and lend them money to re-lend it. So what's the answer? This, in a sense, was already covered in, I think, in Esther's lecture. So think. Is that fair? Yeah.
The answer to this question, really, I guess, I think, like to this specific question, maybe that's not really what you're after, goes like quite a bit beyond what we talked about with Esther. Because in the case of General Motors, it's like politically expedient. Like, people like politicians in the U.S. want to give votes. Like, who's going to vote for you? Because
Forget about
everybody
General Motors. Let's talk about MIT. MIT can get credit at a much lower rate than and much more easily. So maybe General Motors is a particularly bad example. I can get credit at a much lower rate than this woman. Forget about General Motors. I pay 4.69% on my home mortgage. The lowest microfinance rates in India are 24%. Yeah.
I mean, the simple answer, or like the answer that's one step removed, is the fact that any loans that you make, or that MIT makes, or that MIT gets, or that you get, or that General Motors gets, can therefore be securitized and go onto market. So the access of potential lenders is much broader than if you were just simply interacting with a bank. I mean, the same thing you can make with Grameen Bank. The question why
they could package loans and sell them off. If there was demand for it, why wouldn't they just? I mean, securitization is just. You're completely right, but that's in fact, BRAC actually did securitize a bunch of its loans and sell them off. BRAC is another big MFI in Bangladesh. Yeah.
I mean, the reason why they're paying higher rates isn't necessarily access to money, it's the fixed costs associated with lending to them.
Exactly.
There's incredibly high fixed costs.
In other words, the first point to be made is that if you want to, the movie seemed to imply that there was some magic that, was involved because, somehow these borrowers are just inherently out of their own whatever, somehow out of their whatever, whoever they are, they just repay. If that were the case, then it would be very easy to lend to them at the same kinds of rates as anybody else gets. Or I'm certainly not more reliable than these people in equilibrium. In equilibrium, they're very reliable. They pay back 98% of the time. The important sentence there is in equilibrium. They are repaying because there's a machine that Grameen Bank runs which makes sure that they repay. And that machine is costly. So when we say they are very reliable, this is not a statement about some intrinsic reliability. Evidence for that is very clear. If you look at, there were actually government lending programs for the poor before the microfinance boom, like in the 60s and 70s. And if you were to read books written in the 1970s by expert economists, the view was you can never lend to the poor. They're not reliable lenders because those loans were not repaid. The government loans were the repayment rates were often 35%, not 98%. And that's just says that it's nothing to do with being poor. It has to do with how they have organized the process of making sure that people repay. And so, whatever goes into that organization is inherently costly. So you have to do many things to make sure that they repay. Those things have a cost, and that's why in the end you can't lend to them at 5% per year, because those costs have to be somehow covered. So it is when we see somebody repay, it is not the case that means that happens absent any effort by anybody. People repay because there is a system. Now, I'm not saying that the system is necessarily one of pointing a gun at them. I'm sure Grameen Bank is not pointing, but there's a whole set of, like for example, Spandana, which is an organization I'll talk about later, they have this system by which if you don't repay, the guy who's supposed to be your loan collector comes and parks himself in front of your house. He just sits there. And it's kind of embarrassing to have some strange man sitting in front of your house for hours and hours and coming back and generally whining all the time. And so, now, that guy has to be paid a salary. He doesn't do it out of the goodness of his heart. How does Spandana pay the salary? It raises the interest rate on the loan. So it is not the case that there's no magic here. Now, in equilibrium, you don't have to do, if you can make it credible enough, you don't have to do it that often. But you still have to do it sometimes to demonstrate. You don't have to do it that often because I know that if I don't repay, that guy will show up, sit in front of my house and whine for days. So I'm going to anticipate that and pay. But he also does other things. It's his job to, one of the reasons why people repay is also the fact that the obligation to repay is very small. You don't have to repay, hundreds of dollars. You have to repay $5 every month or $2 every week. And if you're repaying $2 every week, that's a lot easier than repaying $500 if you're poor. So part of the way the loan repayment is assured is by giving them very small loans. That's why, even if you didn't make a lot of money on your business, you can just, maybe you can just go out and work in the road gang or something for 2 hours, make the money and pay back. So this is easy to pay back. So you have the ability to pay back. So that comes from the fact that the loans are small. The other part of that is that they have weekly collection. One reason why you are always able to repay is that I come and collect from you every week. That way you never have $5,000 to repay. You always have $2 or $3 or $5 to repay. And why is that good? Because then, again, it's easy for you. You're always able to do it. Why is it bad? What's the cost of that?
The high cost of collection because people have to go there.
Yeah, somebody has to show up every week to collect. So those are the costs which turn into high interest rates. There's no magic to the fact that these guys repay. There's a whole system, of very, I think, very clever design which goes into it. But it isn't accidental that they repay. It's not some magic that these women are just different from everybody else. We used to, as I said, we used to think that none of these people will repay. And that was based on experience with other programs which were badly run and nobody repaid. The same people didn't used to repay, now they repay. Why? Because the program is well designed. Yeah.